I believe in good moves. Those are the words by Gukesh that emulated the former world champion Bobby Fischer in today's press conference following the conclusion of round 4. Let's see how the game went. So, in this game, Ding Liren had his second white game of the match, and he came to the table, almost surprisingly, with knight to f3, and it was pointed out at the time, and indeed in the press conference, that this has never been seen by Ding Liren. He's always played other openings, such as d4, and as we've seen so far, e4. And, well, it showed that the idea behind it is, as it's named, the Rete opening after Richard Rete from last century in fact, that with the idea being you develop knight, you decline to develop any of your central pawns, and you wait. You wait for black to develop some pieces, maybe push a pawn, and that's exactly what happened. Why not? If white isn't clarifying in the center, black says, I will instead. And there followed the second curious move, e3, still refusing to commit here, waiting to see where Gukesh perhaps puts his bishop, whether g6 with a fianchetto is played, or an eventual e5 or e6 with this bishop coming this way. And, well, as the opening continued, knight f6, another sensible move, not committing anything. If white's committed their knight, of course, black can definitely commit their knight as well. And then black had to face against white's fianchetto with presumably this idea of bishop to b2. However, let's see what happened. After a few minutes more thinking, Gukesh elected to play a reversed London system. And, well, it's worth noting that white is a tempo up on the main line of the Queen's Indian, and I'll just put that on the board. The Queen's Indian occurs after d4, knight f6, c4 most commonly. Knight f3 is possible with c4 on the third move, but usually c4 on the second move. And after e6, if knight f3, black can play the b6 move for the pawn. And the idea is to put the bishop here, or perhaps even to a6, and strike at some pawns, strike at the center, and so on and so forth. And later on, black will strike back with potentially any of these pawn breaks. All three have been tried with d6, d5, c5 structures, even being attempted, but certainly d5 as well, and even d5 and c5 in combination. So, very vibrant position. And let's see how that compares to the game, because in the game, this is an identical position, except black has yet to play c5, and that's the point. Black is a tempo down, of course, and, well, I think Ding had a lot in store had c5 been played. Gukesh, of course, declined. They played bishop f5, the reverse London system, and this marked bishop e2 played by Ding, and this sets a little bit of a trap, perhaps in the future, of if automatically e6, this bishop can't retreat too much, and there's possible knight h4s, maybe winning the bishop pair after bishop g6. As a result, Gukesh very sensibly played h6, and at this moment, so the first semi-surprise following the first surprise of knight f3 on move 1, of bishop a3. Now, I would not recommend this if you are a beginner player, because the bishop on a3, and likewise if we have a fianchettoed but went as far to h3 with the other bishop, often this just gets attacked. There's various queen a5 checks that you have to be very careful of, and it can be gained a tempo against with moves like e6 and e5. And for all of those reasons, on top of that, the bishop often belongs on b2 if you're going to fianchetto the bishop. b2 to attack e5, and if you ever fianchettoed this guy on g2, it attacks the center like this. Whereas from the rim, well, knights on the rim are dim, and bishops often don't like to be there too much either, as a general rule. However, in this specific position, it is a viable idea, and as we'll see, it has been played before. Knight bd7, developing a sensible move, declining to release the tension between these two bishops, which, as we'll see, is very relevant. Ding castled. And it's worth saying that at this moment, e6 was played, and this followed a game between none other than Yasser Seirawan and his opponent as far back as 1978, where after captures on f8, well, in this position, c4 was played, and here's where it diverges. In the game, Gukesh retreated back with the knight first. in the case of Yesasarowan, he played c6, making a nice solid pawn chain, and there followed knight c3, knight 8, d7, d4, castles kingside, rook c1. All very sensible moves, keeping the c-file in check. After queen e7, queen d2, knight e4, queen b2. We have a very interesting position. Black is fortifying their d5 pawn. White is putting pressure, hoping for a minority attack, potentially in some positions, known as the Carlsbad structure. And this is a very different game to what happened today. However, I just wanted to highlight some ideas that perhaps Ding didn't want to go into. As he later clarified in the press conference, that he was guided more by computers than old games, and indeed setting up this structure for black very solid, and perhaps going into what's ultimately a very Slav defense-esque structure, well, he perhaps didn't want to do that. So as we'll see, there are benefits to leaving all the way back here. Leaving this pawn here, c4 is definitely the right idea, and that's indeed what Ding played. And we have an interesting position after knight back, because black has played the knight to here, captured this, and come back. So that's 3 tempi. But to achieve that, white has played 2 moves to capture a piece that was undeveloped. And if that's, 3 moves versus 2 moves, well, white start to move up in any case, and also they've almost helped black castle on the next turn. So it's a bit of a toss-up in terms of what's good and what's bad. I often say there's a bit of a scaling up the scenario, doing a bit of an analysis, static analysis of everything. Well, in terms of the moves, black has wasted time, but so has white. Definitely the bishop trading off is interesting, has benefits and hindrances for both sides. And well, let's see what Ding had in store. Why had he chosen this opening? And it was at this moment, white to play. Ding spent around about 18 minutes on knight to c3, and clearly he'd started to get out of his preparation and was trying to work out, what do I do? Do I go in for the aforementioned d4 things? He was very much aware, almost certainly, of that as an option, but clearly he decided to just develop knight first, not commit with the d-pawn, leave this square for the knight to attack the bishop, which, as we will see, is very, very relevant. Black now castled, very sensible move. And after c takes d5, e takes d5, b4, we've reached a minority attack type position where white with 2 pawns is attacking black with 3/4 pawns. And the idea is to open lines and try and prove that these are a little bit weak. There is a semi-open file here, and that's White's plan. Develop the queen to b3, push the a-pawn. If white can achieve some a5 pushes, as we'll see, maybe a knight can jump to the outpost of c5 in some positions and attack some weak pawns. Let's see what happens. c6, very traditional move. Only playing it now noticeably, and perhaps that's an indictment of the computer age. There was no need, as happened in the Yesasarowan game, to play c6 so early, potentially. And only now that b5 is a possibility clamping down the space does black now commit with c6. Perhaps there were some earlier possibilities of c5, and hence why leaving the pawn on c7 until now, until it's necessary to push forwards, perhaps is the idea. In any case, knight to d4, the aforementioned gaining of a tempo. The bishop retreats to safety, still controlling a lot of space. There's some positions where the knight can come to d3, and maybe even to c4. So there's some definite weaknesses as a result of not having played the pawn to d4. Our knight can jump forward, but so can black's. And there followed queen b3, activating, leaving this pawn a little bit undefended, but it's very hard to attack, and in any position where this happens, moves like rook fd1 or even captures are possible, and there are chances to strand the bishop behind a pawn on e4 in such transformations, and just generally we can gain tempo against the bishop on e4, and this could be a weakness. So d2 should be kept under lock and key. For that reason, Gukesh played knight e5, and it was pointed out that this could be the positional things just mentioned, but it also could be quite an attacking venture with knight jumping out of the way, and of course queen out to h4. There are definite possibilities of an attack. And Gukesh made the point that actually it was his idea behind it, whilst this is definitely possible, was also more to defend c6 and essentially with the idea of playing b6 and c5 with the help of rook c8 and sort of starting to set up the idea that white, I have 2 or 3 moves and I'm going to play this idea, try and stop me. Let's see if Ding could mount to the challenge. After a4, very interesting moment where white with a5 could start controlling these squares, and whilst b6, c5 is still very much on the agenda, the move a5 was considered almost an immediate natural response, and it makes a lot of sense because if not, then white achieves it, so the natural way to stop it, to prevent it, would be a5 themselves from black's point of view. And there follows b takes a5, c5, knight d to b5 is an option. They should retreat to f3 and challenge this knight, but I just want to highlight that if knight to here, after d4, well, this knight's going the wrong way, it can't easily jump back, and it might have to come out via this route, which is possible. However, from the c4 square, it's quite a while away, and well, this knight often retreats back and wins this pawn in the meantime. d3 is a tempting move. However, computers suddenly think white's not so bad in this position, with the knight stranded here and this knight coming back. They heavily prefer black. And after d3, bishop d1, well, I saw this in the game and was thinking through this possibility because it really reminded me of one Aaron Nimzovich's My System, who wrote various different ideas, but one of them was if you have the space, control it and use it. He's certainly controlling the space, but can he use e2 and c2? And, well, if you could get a knight here or here, potentially very, very great, or any piece. But, of course, that's not possible. And whilst controlling the space is potentially useful, if white can play around it and perhaps play f4, bishop f3, attack down here, the knight can bounce back to c3, and of course these two knights, the knight pair, are working very, very well together. If white can achieve those things, which there's not much stopping white from doing, then this pawn could become a long-term weakness. If it's controlling space but it can't be used, and the bishop's a bit stuck, and the knight's probably going to retreat, then in the long run, with pressure against potential rook c1, bishop f3, well, perhaps these are more weak than beneficial, whereas if we just contrast that with this moment, where with this knight still tethered and unable to get back to a sensible square, maybe a3 to c4 in the long run, but this knight will rapidly win a5 in such a scenario to challenge it. And now this pawn is quite safe and solid, knight c6 for example, defending, and having not committed to d3, there's no weakness there to attack, and meanwhile, perhaps rook c1, knight takes a5, queen b2, queen e7 pinning, and all of a sudden we see the difference. Black's pieces are more harmonious, the knight is attacking and limiting this knight ultimately, because it can't comfortably get to c4. And meanwhile, this knight is more able to come to e4 without dropping this pawn in some positions. So for all of those reasons, pawn d3, whilst it looks tempting to attack the bishop, well, black can't control the space, as Nimzovich suggests, or black is controlling the space, but can't necessarily use it. And as long as white can play around, well, then white might well have some good chances in such a scenario. That's not what happened in the game, so we'll backtrack to look. And instead, black declined a4 and carried on with the aforementioned plan from earlier, with rook c8, trying to achieve a c5 push. And in this position, well, white played a5, locking down. And if white can achieve knight a4 to c5, a typical Carlsbad structure, well, that would be fantastic. And it's at this moment that if we just retract a5, one mentioned plan was potentially playing a move like f4. And here, specifically, after knight c4, bishop takes, pawn takes, queen takes. If black can play c5 and play bishop d3, they're probably winning the exchange, or at least getting a lot of counterplay. So a5 is a natural move to try and dislodge this pawn, and very successfully, in fact, because now, well, bishop d3 can be achieved, And in this position, the computer gives it a rough, approximate level evaluation, but this is very, very tricky, and I can see why Ding perhaps didn't want to play it. They do have 5 central pawns versus 3 and 2. And, of course, they have this pawn over here locking down. So there's definitely avenues of attack against potential weak positions and points in Black's structures. But Black does have the exchange. The rook is much stronger and long range than the knights. And I can see why Ding was a little bit afraid, albeit this would have been a very decent idea in a lot of positions that Ding actually never played. Let's see what happened in reality. Because after a5, locking down here, Black very rapidly, after just a few minutes thought, played b6. The idea, I'm achieving c5, I'm kicking your knight away, and, well, let's see what Ding had in store. After knight to f3, once again it's worth noting, if f4, now it doesn't work as well. Knight hangs on c4, queen has to retreat to defend, because now if we capture, well, if we take on c4, c5 happens and it's protected. We don't win a pawn over here and get a favourable structure. We capture. This pawn's a bit overextended. It's likely lost in a lot of variations. That's less weak than the b7 pawn in the other scenario. Now to knight to f3, bishop to d3. We lose f1. It's worth noting that if we play to here, then we lose d2, and we don't lose the exchange, but the structure starts to fall apart. So we lose either our lovely structure of 5 pawns or the exchange bishop for the rook. Either way, very not good for us. Going back to this moment, that saw Ding Liren retreat the knight to f3, and this sparks the start of a relatively forced sequence of moves where the knights trade off, d4 occurs, and the start of the end. At this moment, the trades began. The queen almost certainly went to e7. There's no real other sensible move. It's central, it's attacking, it's defending. And now, after bishop takes, knight takes, pawn takes, loads and loads of trades, there's some small chance of the 4 versus 3 with a potential attack against c6, and trading off all the pieces has maybe enabled some small hopes with the rook in a few moments coming to a7. But unfortunately, Black has rooks too. And after controlling the open file, well, the knight was forced. Black declined to capture, so White decided to force the issue and trade the knights. Almost a tacit admission that this is heading towards a trade-off draw. h3, a very sensible move. Before, there are 1,000 different back rank mates. So h3, a very nice prophylactic move. Just defending some squares as well, like this. And c5, the critical trading off. If this doesn't happen, then White could eventually mount up some attacking against c6 or play rook a7. This releases the tension very much in favour for Black. And after the trade off the rooks, captures, we've reached 4v3 with a wing pawn over here on the queen side, and White attacks the pawn. Black played this, and after queen c2, as we'll see, there is one last trick that Black has set White. Black did play rook d5, centralizing the rook, defending the queen, which does do a lot of central attacks. But if, for example, they played h5, feel free to pause the video. Why can't White win a pawn and maybe enter a 4 pawns versus 3 position, which, well, we'll go into that in a moment. Why can't they do this? Of course, the answer is the tactic rook d1. I always say check your checks, and of course both players had seen this and were very, very aware. But because the king can't escape to h2, rook takes d1's forced. There is the idea of a fortress where you can maybe set up a position where Black cannot make progress, but this is not a fortress, not with so many pawns pushing forwards, not with 1,000 different zugzwangs that will happen. And this rook, in typical fortress style, would have had to find an outpost to sit on. It only has one. It needs an auxiliary secondary outpost. For example, if rook a4 ever happens, there will be so many different checks on d1, for example, amongst many other places. It's very hard to not fall into a zugzwang when you have no secondary squares to put pieces. Meanwhile, these pawns will march up the board, probably give the king some shelter as it comes up, and it will be very hard for white to hold this. In any case, certainly not something white wants to have to grovel through. It would be absolute torture for Ding, of course. Was never going to happen. It's worth saying queen c3. The same thing happens. This is even worse because black maintains this pawn, and the one kryptonite of fortresses is passed pawns. They forced the remaining minor piece, the rook, or the more minor piece, and now, of course, this rook not only has no outpost, but the pawn will simply queen. For that reason, queen c2 was selected, maybe looking at this square, both sides looking at the opponent's escape squares, but rook d5, very sensible, and g3. It's worth noting, neither side can offer a draw but before move 40 without a threefold repetition, which happened in game 2. But f5, one last little hint of playing for a win by black, but ultimately this is just locking down on space, a very remarkably positional move. Because black has a great deal of control of the center, they can slightly afford to do this, and it does lock down on white's structure. It's worth noting, when trying to win positions like this, you want to lock down on movements of pawns, and although black realistically with 3 isn't necessarily trying to win, it's certainly an idea to lock down on the squares and keep them immobile from moving or less able to push. For one thing, it invites trades, and the more pawns that come off, the closer we are to a draw. And for another thing, it just means that, well, white can't come at them. White has to meet them in the center or closer to the middle of the board. In any case, king g2, very sensible move. King h7, both sides just improving their king's position. This is so defended that even if, for example, g4 now, well, it does exploit the pin, but even a simple waiting move like queen e6 is absolutely fine. Attacking, coming to g6, releasing the pin, and yeah, very likely things would still lead to a draw. And for that reason, after queen c4, locking down on this 4th rank, the queen retreated, e4 was played, and after rook to here, pawns were traded, further another trade, queen to e4 pinning, counter pin to the king. It was getting closer and closer to the conclusion, which saw the kings walk up the board, and reaching move 40, a threefold repetition occurred on the board. Even if black really makes a mistake, for example, with rook back to here, even in this position, it's still triple zeros by most computers, because 2 pawns versus 3 on the same side of the board is a theoretical draw. Both players would have known that, and it really shows how drawn rook endgames are. All rook endgames are drawn, as the saying goes, and this really highlights that. The point being, these pawns will likely trade each other off. That will leave one pawn, and then you enter the Lucena winning position and the Philidor drawing defense. Very likely the Philidor will be reached. The king is in front of the pawn, all 3 in fact, and so it's very unlikely to ever reach a scenario where either side wins. So a peaceful conclusion to today's game, and we quickly reverse to the opening. An interesting opening attempt where clearly Ding is prioritizing fresh positions without wanting to get into Gukesh's deep prep. And, well, Gukesh held the fort today and played some very sensible moves. After move 8 at this moment here, Ding then had to start thinking on his own, potentially out of his preparation. And there were some moments where perhaps in this position, a few moves later, f4 became increasingly topical, especially when the knight could be attacked. But as Gukesh pointed out in the press conference, well, if f4 immediately, for example, the knight back, and this pawn leaves behind some weaknesses. Yes, it's protected by this pawn, a benefit of not pushing d4 or d3 earlier in the game. But if it ever goes to f5, locking the bishop out, then that leaves space behind to attack. Yes, this bishop's stuck, but you're having to maintain it with 2 pieces. That won't last forever, potentially. And meanwhile, black can attack behind Once again, if you can't use the space, maybe keeping your pieces back just to control the space makes more, the space that you own anyway, makes more sense. So a peaceful conclusion, and of course tomorrow we will see Gukesh with his second white, or third even, white game. Let's see where that takes us in the match. Don't forget to like, comment, share and subscribe. Hope you enjoyed that. Cheers.